Well, hello to everyone here. I'm Jeremy Lent and delighted to welcome you to today's live conversation with my friend and brilliant thinker, Roman Krznaric. So, just by way of context today, much of what we do here on the Deep Transformation Network could be described as basically trying to imagine like a healthy post-capitalist future based on things like tolerance, justice, care for our earth. And well, the problem is that can be difficult to visualize, right? Because our world system today is designed for pretty much the opposite of these good things. There was this great quote from the social critic Frederick Jameson that you might know, famously put it, for most people, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But here's some good news to help us on our way. Roman Krznaric's inspiring new book, History for Tomorrow, shows how much of the groundwork for a potential ecological civilization has already been laid by those who have come before us. And ever since I met Roman some years ago, I've been really impressed by his rare combination of heartfelt compassion, piercing insight, and a fervent commitment to social justice, which I love. And his previous book, The Good Ancestor, contained a whole ton of mind-expanding ideas that I've since incorporated into my own thinking. And now his newest book helps to shine a path to the flourishing future we all want. So I'm delighted today we'll have a chance to hear from Roman himself on the most crucial lessons we can learn from the past and how we might apply them to lead us to the future we want. So, as always, following our initial conversation, you'll be invited to ask questions, engage directly with Roman and me. And even in the first half, while I'm talking with Roman, feel free to put questions in the chat and we'll try to catch them to ask in the second half. And now let's get Roman spotlighted. And so you won't just be seeing me. Hey, great, there you are. Hi, Roman. Welcome.
Hello to you, Jeremy. Hello to everybody listening. It's a great privilege and pleasure to be here. I'm very much looking forward to the adventure of this conversation as we say things we've never said before,
Yes,
which
exactly.
always seems to me to be the mark of a good conversation. So let's
I
get into it.
agree. And that's absolutely, absolutely. Well, so I was mentioning to you as we were kind of planning for this. I got your book on Audible a couple of months ago, and I so enjoyed hearing your voice actually narrating it. I recommend that to people. But when I was driving, it felt like you were sitting in the passenger seat talking to me, and there are a number of times I had to pull over to make notes about something I heard to make sure I wouldn't lose it. So you're a little bit of a danger to my my health and safety. But now we have the chance to talk together about it. So uh, to begin with, I'd just love to ask you, Roman, what inspired you to write this book, which is kind of an unusual topic, and just so curious about that.
It was a kind of act of madness to write this book in a way because, what I've done is look at 10 major challenges facing humanity in the 21st century, from the risks of the climate crisis to threats from artificial intelligence and the crumbling of democracy and growing inequalities, and ask what can we learn from the last 1,000 years of human history to look at each of those 10 issues in more effective or innovative ways. So it's a kind of gargantuan task. And I was kind of led to it in a way by an utter frustration, really, with our politicians and policymakers who seem so trapped in the tyranny of the now, responding to the latest tweet, the next opinion poll, or they're crossing their fingers and hoping that the tech bros in Silicon Valley are going to sort out our civilizational problems for us and rescue us with geoengineering or carbon capture and
Mhm.
storage. And it
Mhm.
really struck me that there's something missing here, which is an appreciation of the fact that history itself is, I think, one of the most undervalued resources for thinking about the future of people and planet. We often talk about needing to tap into new resources to navigate the turbulence of our times, wind power, solar energy. Well, there's one we're failing to tap into, which is history. We have
Mhm.
vast amounts of the stuff, layer upon layer of wisdom from our ancestors. And I'm thinking about history not as something that can help us predict the future. This is not about history as a clairvoyant, but history as a counselor. History as a kind of a guide. And on a more personal level, I was very much drawn into this by the fact that I grew up around the kitchen table talking to my father and stepmother, who both were refugees from Europe to Australia after the Second World War, that history was so alive for them. Whether it was you know, my stepmom would always be saying, well, look, you can't understand the wars in the former Yugoslavia unless you understand hundreds of years of conflict
Yeah.
between Serbs and Croats and so on. But one of the things about this book is much of our learning about the past, the way we think about the past, is to think about warnings. So,
Mm.
that famous aphorism, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Yeah.
And of course, we must not repeat so many things that we have done, the genocides, the colonialisms, the interwar fascism. But I also wanted to talk about what went right as well as what went wrong, to look at the inspiration as well as the calamities and catastrophes. So I'm trying to sort of build a vision of radical hope from gazing across the landscape of history.
Yeah, love that. And I feel you did exactly that. And and that's the thing, as you know, Roman, and many people here know, I'm in the middle of writing this book on an ecological civilization, basically about how we can transform our entire system, our entire world system, into something that is truly life affirming. And this is what as as I was going through your book, I kept going. Almost every one. I mean, not some that there were some that were brand new to me, but so many of the examples you took were they exactly the things that are on the topics that I want to be laying out in this book. So it just felt so exciting and so enriching. And so let's actually go to some of those topics right now. So one that I saw you put early on in the book, and it's obviously is crucial to an ecological civilization, and it's so inspiring and kind of powerful to hear about it, is the notion of the circular economy. I mean, so many people, I mean, I think pretty much everyone here knows why we need a circular economy, but then how do we actually make that happen is the big question. And you've got this incredibly powerful example that you talk about of the city of Edo, right, which is now is in modern day Tokyo, but under the 17th and 18th century, under the Tokugawa dynasty. Do you want to say more about it? Like why that is relevant to us today?
Yeah, in a way, it goes back to the Frederick Jameson quote about it's easier to imagine the world than the end of capitalism, because actually, with a little bit of historical imagination, we can start imagining post-capitalist futures by realizing that in order to go forwards, we sometimes need to look backwards. And one of the places we can find a kind of alternative to our hyper-consumer capitalist culture driven by a philosophy by shop, therefore I am, is in Japan, particularly in the 18th century. So, imagine you are standing on the old Nihonbashi Bridge in that ancient city of Edo, today's Tokyo, as you mentioned.
Mhm.
It's around the year 1750, as you said, the era of the Tokugawa shoguns. And there are people chatting away, twirling their colorful bamboo umbrellas. There are traders taking seafood to the fish market on the other side of the bridge. There are people pushing cartloads of rice on old wooden carts. And this was a wooden powered civilization. They were as dependent on wood, on timber, as we are today on oil. It was also interesting because Edo at the time, Tokyo, was a big city, talking over 1 million people, so far bigger than London or Paris at the time. But the extraordinary thing about it, as you mentioned, was that they had what we would today call a circular economy, where they refurbished, reused, repurposed, repaired, recycled almost everything. And partly because Japan had a policy of not trading with the outside world, there were shortages of key resources like timber and cotton. So they developed, for instance, a tradition of patchwork known as boro, which means tattered rags, where they would take bits of old cotton and they would sew them into garments and then pass those garments down from generation to generation. And I am proud to tell you at this very moment, I am wearing a genuine boro jacket, which is
Oh,
over
wow.
a hundred years old. You can see how it's patchworked together. Right?
Is it beautiful? It looks beautiful. It looks
I
like,
know it's
yeah.
extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I'm very proud of my Bodo jacket, but this is a piece of living history in a way. So they not only had this Bodo tradition, they'd also, if you had a kimono, you might wear it during the day, and when it wore out, you turn it into pajamas. You'd wear it at night, and then you chop it up into diapers, into nappies. Then you turn it into cleaning cloths and burn it as fuel afterwards because cotton was so precious. There were thousands of small businesses on the streets of Edo collecting candle wax to be remolded, used candle wax, or down and out samurai who'd be repairing old umbrellas. They'd even pay you for your human waste and sell it on as agricultural fertilizer. And then alongside that, as you know, Jeremy, they had one of the world's first large-scale plantation forestry regimes because they had
Yes.
decimated their old growth forests before that. And they also had timber rationing too. And they built had modular houses where you could basically take your house apart afterwards and move it somewhere else. So it was what I think of as one of the first large scale urban examples of a low waste, low carbon
Yeah.
ecological civilization. And of course, this is just one example. We could go to the ancestral circular economy of pre colonial Hawaii, for example,
Right.
where also very large scale circular systems. But I think Edo is such an interesting example, partly because it's also very well documented. We know a hell of a lot about it. Um, and it really raises very interesting questions. And one other little thing I'd raise about it is that, often I'm sure many people on this call have heard this sort of idea that, oh, you environmentalists, you want us to all go back living in caves, don't
Right.
you?
Right. Right.
Your material frugality is going to send us back to cave person time. Well, sorry, if you look at Edo, this was not living in caves. This was a time of enormous cultural flourishing. Yes, it was feudal, it was
Yeah.
patriarchal,
Hmm.
like so many other societies at the time.
Hmm.
But it was a time of cultural flourishing, the time of the paintings of Hiroshige, the poetry of Basho, the flowering of sumo wrestling. Who wouldn't want that? So I think there's a lot to start thinking about
Yeah.
to
And
reimagine. Well, what can we actually then pick up from that today?
yeah. Well, I mean, that is clearly so important what you say. But then I mean, the big question that comes to my mind and to others too is so much of that is a cultural milieu. And our culture right now is about as far from that as could be with advertising, capitalism driven consumerism. And so how can we apply that? What are some of the key insights that you think could be if not sort of not saying tomorrow or next year, but we talk about three horizons thinking, like the third horizon is ecological civilization out there, but then there's second horizon, transformative changes that move us towards there. What are some examples
Well,
that
take
are
that idea of the circular economy, like in Europe, where I am. Well, I'm
yeah,
in Britain. Well, I like to hope that it's connected to Europe in some way. There's a lot of talk about how do we create circular economies.
yeah, yeah.
And, if we were going to take edonomics seriously, we would rapidly phase out the sale, for example, of a standard smartphone, which uses over 50
Mm,
elements from the periodic table and gets thrown away after less than 3 years. And
yeah.
we would introduce very strict regulations saying the only phones that you can sell, let's give the companies 5 years, say, or 3 years. The only phones you can sell must have recycled rare earth metals in them. They must be
Mm,
modular so that you can repair your own change the battery and repair the screen and this kind of thing. And we've banned the sale of asbestos because of its damage to personal health. We can do the same to the consumer items which damage planetary health. And
yeah.
we're just talking here about you don't need a military dictatorship to do this like they had in Tokugawa, Japan. You just need regular regulation.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's just one area where we can start having a conversation and realize that somewhere like Edo, Japan, there's a whole ecosystem of this. And then a second thing I think to think about, and this is, I think, more challenging, is the way that they had rationing
Hmm.
in Edo, Japan. And it wasn't just like the rationing in Britain or the US in the Second World War, which was for
Right.
just for a few years. I mean, this was for decades,
Yeah.
even longer. So they developed a culture of sufficiency around that. And I think we are on the verge of a new public conversation about rationing. I'm talking here in the global north to sort of decelerate our hyper consumerism, rationing of red meat, rationing of carbon, and major
Mhm.
thinkers like the French economist Thomas Piketty are starting to talk about personal carbon allowances.
Yeah.
Doing
Yeah.
it, of course, in a fair way. Um, and it's a challenging thing for politicians, but I think this problem ain't going to go away.
Yeah, no, I absolutely hear you on that. And one other thing, just to add to your ideas, that I'm also think is, to me, a pathway towards that ecological civilization is the idea of pricing in externalized costs. So to your whole point, like the cost of something is not just what you pay for it or what went into the raw materials, but the cost to the entire ecology, ecosystem of Earth. And if we put a dollar cost on that, which can be done and put that into the price, that would also be like a step towards that same kind of.
Absolutely right. So if you go online and if you want to buy a new phone, one option you have is to buy something
Yeah.
called a Fairphone, which is a Dutch company which
Mm.
does try to put the full costs, the impacts on the living world and on the laborers down the supply chain into the cost of the phone. It's a little bit chunky, a little bit heavy. We
Mhm.
have one in our household. It's totally modular. It's
Yeah.
recycled. It is the future of the phone.
Yeah,
But of course, we can't even have a world of, you know, a billion more of Dutch Fairphones. We also have to scale back our consumption. That's
exactly.
why that rationing
Exactly. And that's why
conversation is also very important.
totally hear you, Roman, on that. Thanks. That's great. And so let's move on to another of these. This is a theme I'm super excited by in my research on ecological civilization, and that's why this is one of the times I was pulling over my car to note down when you were talking about it. This whole theme of citizens' assemblies as a different form of approaching democracy. And I loved how you said in your book, let's get one thing straight. I think you said at some point, representative government, so-called electoral democracy, was invented to prevent democratic politics, not to enable it. And it's no longer fit for purpose. And I think, again, most people here today will say yes. And like, so we want to go is where we go from there. And I loved how you talked about these different examples, all the way from Africa to something I'd never heard of before. I don't know how you pronounce it, the Rhaetian Free State or whatever. Perhaps you could just give us some of these other examples of true democracy that is in our past that we can learn from and bring into our future.
Sure, this conversation or this element of democracy is really quite important for me on a personal level because I used to be a university professor teaching democratic theory and practice and political science and stuff like that. And back in the 1990s, and when I was doing that, I used to teach a course, the 101 course on democracy at some university, and it never occurred to me that there was any other kind of democracy than what we think of a democracy, representative government. Electing these experts who would rule in our stead. Right? It never really occurred to me that there was any other way of doing it. And, it's taking me years, to my shame, to realize that actually, historically, there are so many other forms of democracy. And the starting point is, as you say there, to recognize that the kind of government we have, representative democracy, broadly invented in the 17th, 18th, early 19th centuries in North America, in Europe. That system was designed to keep out the mob, the real citizens. They were scared of citizens. So they wanted to have an elite layer in between. And that's kind of how democracy, I think, pretty much emerged in France, in the United States, in Britain and other countries. And we can go back to many cultures and places for alternatives. You can go to Igbo communities in Nigeria. When the British first arrived in the Igbo territories, they couldn't find any leaders. It must have annoyed them. They were looking for a chief. They assumed a chief, right? But of course, there are deep traditions of communal and consensus-based democracy in many parts of Africa. And Igbo people had a kind of multi-layered democracy, which started at the ground level with village communal assemblies, which men and women could come to, and then they might have another level up. They would delegate decisions up for bigger decisions to village chiefs, and then they would have maybe some kind of regional councils and things like that. So it was a kind of what we call a social anarchist form of government.
Mhm.
And it's also accords with, as we're both very interested in the work of Ellen Ostrom, the idea of polycentric governance, the
Right.
idea of you start at the lowest level and then you build up your system. So you had that in West Africa, in Igbo communities in Nigeria, and of course you had similar ones. You mentioned there the Free State of Rhaetia, one of the best kept secrets in the history of democracy in Switzerland. today's Switzerland between 1523 and 1799, they basically had another form of communal democracy. They had this region in today's Switzerland had about 250 local councils, which would then delegate decisions up to a commune level of about 50 communes, and they had a Bundestag, a sort of federal assembly that meet a couple of times a year. And of course, anyone who was listening to Deep Transformation conversation not long ago on Rojava would
Yes.
recognize this, okay? Because in Rojava, in Kurdish-controlled Syria,
Mhm.
they have a very similar um, form of government. And it's not surprising because there are direct historical links, because as was discussed on that excellent session that you had, that they were partly influenced, not wholly, by the writings of the social ecologist and former anarchist Murray Bookchin. And Bookchin, had written all about Switzerland. He talked about assembly government and sortition or citizens' assemblies in ancient Greece, and his works were famously read by Abdullah Öcalan, the great leader
Mhm.
of the Kurdish revolutionary leader, who
Right.
brought it together with Kurdish traditional ideas of government into something that can make us rethink today what democracy should look like. So we can partly, the point I would make here
Right.
is often when people are looking for alternatives to democracy, they do go back into history and they go back to ancient Greece, right?
Mhm.
As a sort of easy go-to Western place. And yes, ancient Greece did have direct assembly government,
Mhm.
elements of that. They did have what we today call sortition, so random
Yeah.
selection of people for political office, like we do for juries, and they had
Mhm.
it more broadly. But what I would say is that to recognize that these were not one-off, this was not a one-off in ancient Greece, right? There were many other traditions of this, and that's why it's such a rich tradition for us to draw on today. In
Yes.
fact, one final thing I just say here is that on Monday, I'm going to be in the Netherlands and I'm going to be speaking to the Dutch Parliament. And I'm going to be saying to them, you need a citizens' assembly. In fact, you ought to replace your
Right.
upper house, your Senate, either with a citizens' assembly, randomly selected, or at least have 50% of it chosen like has been chosen through history in many cultures, like our juries, random selection. I don't know. What do you think of that, Jeremy? Tell me your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, this to me is the vision of where we need to head as an ecological civilization. We have to, and to your point, you spoke about this in the book, and I really loved it. Is it's not just, I mean, right now, citizens' assemblies have been shown to work, right, in Europe and other places, as a sort of recommendation body, like where people trust them, and so they can actually shift, like impacts, like in Ireland or whatever, because people trust how they deliberate and what they do. But your point, I loved this. This was so important how you were at a conference, right, about citizens' assemblies, and you asked about whether they should be given real decision-making power. And you said it was kind of split down the room. There's some people who go, oh no, 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 they should just be recommendations. And about half the people were supporting that. And kind of curious about that because I in fact, if anything, I might even go a little further than you in terms of you were saying at some point, I don't think that representative democracy should be dismissed outright, which I think is reasonable to say in a book like you write, but in a totally third horizon ecological civilization, I really wonder. I mean, you were mentioning Helen Landemore, who's a great writer on this. And she points out, like, really, electoral democracies bring out the worst kind of people and the worst instincts in people, the ones who aren't thoughtful, the ones who, just big swaggering, like sort of trust me and I'll get it all, the sort of Trump type. And so even good politicians are only effective when they take on some of these negative attributes.
Yeah.
But anyway, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. That's sort of the community of people,
Yes.
citizens assemblies, and what that thinking is. It's very, very important.
So I'm a big advocate of citizens' assemblies. I realize they have lots of problems that, we're just learning in a way to bring them into the design of democratic politics in the modern era. I mean, in the last 10 years in Western countries, there have been over 250 citizens' assemblies on issues from the climate crisis to AI and aging populations. I
Mhm.
think we need to be creative in what we do with them. So, in the chat, Nat has just suggested that in Britain, the House of Lords should become a House of Citizens elected by citizens' assemblies. And I've been, advocating this myself in some recent sort of political circles with Extinction Rebellion and on the radio and TV and things like that. And I'm a believer in that. I think the question is, how do you get the politicians to give up their power? And I
Hmm.
think one of the things we've learned from the Irish Citizens Assembly on the issue of abortion, a very hot political topic, one of the reasons, even though it only gave recommendations, it didn't have the power to legislate. What
Right.
it did is it created a public conversation. So you
Yes.
may have only had 100 members of the Citizens Assembly, but what's really fundamental is to shift the cultural conversation. I think that's what happens when citizens' assemblies work best. And we also know that there are more emerging models of more permanent, powerful citizens' assemblies. In East Belgium, there's now a permanent citizens' assembly. In Brussels, there's a citizens' assembly on the climate, which is permanent. So I think we're moving in that direction. I think it's very important to bring up that point you mentioned, which that some people say, well, citizens' assembly should be kind of advisory to the existing system. And others think that they should basically replace the existing system. I'm very much on the side of we need to move on from this dying system of representative government, which is absolutely a system of the Holocene. It was invented in a time with very, very different problems than we had
Hmm.
today. At the time, it was invented to replace monarchical and aristocratic government, to develop nation states, to run an industrial civilization. We're now trying to run an ecological civilization, and we need the right kind of politics for that. The one little caveat I would have is, yes, I do say in my book, we probably need to retain some elements of representation. And that point came out of a long conversation I had with the British democratic theorist Anthony Barnett. He said,
Hmm.
look, this is him talking. He said, he's a great thinker, very important
Yeah.
thinker in this field. He said, look, and he wrote one of the first great books in the 1990s saying that the House of Lords in Britain should be replaced by sortition, a citizens'
Hmm.
assembly.
Great.
So he's for it, but he said, like, in the end, someone needs to make the rules for the citizens' assembly, right? Someone
Yeah.
needs to be held to account for how it works. Because what happens if a corporate takeover starts happening? What happens if factions start dominating? There needs to be some forms of checks and balances, but it definitely doesn't need to look like the existing House of Commons, Congress, and so on. We can
Mhm.
do a lot better than that. And
Yeah.
one other thing I'd add here, going back
Yeah.
to the point about polycentric governance,
Hmm.
building up the layers,
Hmm.
there is a strong movement now to have a global assembly. And there have, in fact, been global citizens' assemblies have been held. And I
Yes.
think
Hmm.
this is a model we need to start experimenting with, at least something which is a global accountability body, which looks different from what we've tried before, from the
Yeah.
League of Nations, the United Nations,
Yeah.
um, something much more deeply democratic.
I love this, Roman. And to your point that you're saying about Rojava before, that's a model right now of this kind of polycentric governance, right? Where you have the grassroots democracy at the block level going all the way up to a region of millions of people being managed along these lines. So such important theme. I also wanted
Can I add
to,
one
yeah, yeah,
tiny little
absolutely.
thing to this, very short?
Excellent.
When we that conversation about Rojava, there were some critiques of it from the speakers themselves, or
Yes.
recognition of the
Right.
challenges of
Hmm.
people don't have time to go to meetings all the time, or sometimes they just want to delegate power up the chain and things like that, or that the patriarchy returns in the household.
Hmm.
Even if maybe it's been eroded somewhat
Exactly.
in the neighborhood assemblies, and I think it's really important to recognize that. Look, it's very easy to offer a new
Hmm.
system and then to quickly shoot it down
Hmm.
with arguments saying that this isn't going to work. And our mutual friend, the great British environmental writer George Monbiot, says the thing about the Rojava kind of model is that it works better in practice than it does in theory. And I think that's
Yes.
absolutely right.
I know. That's a
It's,
great statement. Yeah.
there's always going to be problems, but it's not as if our existing system doesn't have any problems. So let us start to rebuild, reimagine, rethink, and re-citizen ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I love that. And there's so many other themes of these kind of things we can touch on. But what I want to do is make sure we spend some time before we turn it to everyone else who's going to ask tons of questions. I see Guy has his hand up already. That's great. So stay there, Guy. We'll get to you. Um, but I also want to talk with you a little bit because you wrote a lot in your book about sort of like how change happens. That it's great to look at these ideas, but how do we get there from here? And something I got to say I loved is you quoted from this book by Walter Scheidel, the historian who wrote this book called The Great Leveler, which essentially, as you summarized it, is he's looked systematically at history and says essentially the only really truly radical changes towards equality only happen from the worst things like mass warfare and bloody revolution, state failure, pandemics. That's the only time in history. And I love it at some point you say, no historical thesis could be more disempowering. And I agree. And I read his book carefully, and I've been really thinking through like how can we respond to that? And there you were responding to it with some really, really deeply thought out, powerful counterexamples. So let's talk about those two real quick. Like why don't we talk first about Kerala, which is one of the most dramatic stories of transformation that I've ever come across in history. So you want to just give us a brief heads up on that?
Yeah, that Walter Scheidel book, which I found fascinating, I also found it really infuriating because that thesis that, it's only cataclysm that brings about change, it just does not hold up to historical
Right.
scrutiny. I mean, anybody who's studied the history of social movements, the development of welfare states, anything like that will know that you can find many examples systematically. The whole fields of political sociology dedicated to this. I used to do a lot of work on this, thinking about how social movements have brought about change. In Kerala, in the south of India, the state in south of India, as big as Canada or Poland, is one of them, which was, a state which, starting in the 19th century, when it was quite unusual in the way that it spread education to quite poor men and women as well, became a highly politicized society which organized women's movements campaigning against the caste system, trade unions campaigning for the rights of workers, peasant movements campaigning against landlord oligarchies. And over a period of decades,
Yeah.
they transformed their society to one which today is one of the most equal states in India, has the highest scores in the Human Development Index of all the states, and it seems to be kind of one of those so-called mysteries that development economists love looking at. But
Right.
actually, to understand why that happens, it's not just because of benevolent government; it's because of history from below, power from below, and this is part of a larger story in my book about how change happens. I've been obsessed with this topic. In fact, I wrote a report for Oxfam back in 2007 or 2008 called How Change Happens. And I
Mhm.
studied
Right.
theories of change in over a dozen academic disciplines. How do lawyers think about change? How do anthropologists do it and political scientists? So I've been delving in and out of this. But in this, my new book, History for Tomorrow,
Yeah.
the conclusion I've come to is a kind of a thesis, which I
Mhm.
call the disruption nexus. And in fact, I'm going to show you
Great.
this because
Let's do that.
it's a
Yeah.
triangular model, and I actually have it here. I don't know if anyone can see this, but this is
I
imagine a
love it.
triangle with three elements. You can see them there: crisis, movements, and ideas.
Hmm.
Um, and what I've found is that it is true. Walter Scheidel is right that yes, transformative change happens at times of revolutions and wars and pandemics. The US government banned the production of private cars in the Second World War. Yeah, exceptional circumstance. But the question I ask myself, what are the other contexts outside those contexts in which we get rapid transformative change that
Hmm.
that shift onto another horizon, to go back to the three horizons diagram, the
Right.
really transformative stuff that kickstarts us. Um, because what we know is that in general, a crisis isn't enough to get a government to change. You can have a 2008 financial crisis and the old banks and the old system gets bailed out and we still got the same system. Or you can
Hmm.
have wildfires in California and floods in Brazil. It doesn't change very much. And what you need are these three elements of the disruption nexus to come
Hmm.
together. So one element is a crisis. You do
Right.
need some kind of crisis
Right.
there to happen. A melting ice sheet, whatever it happens to be. The second thing you need are the movements. You need disruptive movements which amplify the sense of crisis and in a way scare the elites into pushing the issue onto the up the agenda, shifting the Overton window. And the third element you need are the visionary ideas, powerful ideas. Now, I don't quote Milton Friedman very often, but he did say,
Mhm.
a crisis is an opportunity for change, but the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. So you need these three elements of the nexus. So one simple example would be Berlin, 1989, the downfall of state socialism in East Germany. You had the three elements. You had the crisis, a leadership crisis in East Germany, partly because they were all infighting over their different reactions to the reforms of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. You had
Right,
the ideas, in a way,
right,
old ideas about democratic freedoms, freedom of movement, partly coming out of the work of Václav Havel, his famous essay, The Power of the Powerless. And then you had the third element, you had the disruptive movements. You had the
right.
great uprisings in Leipzig in October 1989. You had then the great, in early November, the people on the street in Berlin, finally, November the 9th, the wall came tumbling down,
Mhm.
metaphorically and physically.
Yeah.
Um, and we can see what happens sometimes when we don't have all three of those elements. Like, let's say, 2008 financial crisis. You've got the crisis, you've got the movements, the Occupy movement. But did we really have the new economic models then? I would say no. I'd say that they weren't enough in the public sphere. Now we're moving. We've got more options. We've got modern monetary theory. We've got donor economics. We've got degrowth, post-growth models, well-being stuff. You know,
Yes.
we've got the third corner of the triangle. And one final thing I'd say on this is that, the disruptive movements, you see the patterns through history. You see the disruption in Kerala. You see the uprising of enslaved people in Jamaica in 1831 on British sugar plantations, the
Yes.
Indian independence movement, suffragettes in Finland and in Britain and other places. And all of that speaks to the ecological crisis of today, where
Hmm.
in my kid's school, there is literally on the wall a fresco of Emmeline Pankhurst, the British suffragette who was jailed as a just disruptor. There's a picture of her literally being arrested, right? And now she's celebrated at the school. It's just like a local state school.
Right.
But the equivalent figures, the Greta Thunbergs, the many activists of Just Stop Oil in prison now, they are treated as pariahs by the media and by our political systems, legal systems. They're being put in jail. So there's a huge failure to understand how change happens here.
Yes, exactly. And you write at some length about this key concept of the radical flank, right? How it's not like everyone has to be joining Just Stop Oil, and but the fact that they're doing it brings the conversation in, and then people start to say, "Well, I don't agree with them, but yeah, I'll support XR. They seem to be more reasonable nowadays." And so that's where that it gets have such an impact, and that I just wanted to end before we turn to Guy's patiently had his hand up. And now an invitation to others. If you have any questions, perspectives you want to share, now's the time to click your Zoom hand.
Could I
And
just say there are amazing comments in the chat all the way. I mean, it's quite
yeah,
incredible. This is like a digital coffee house from the early 1700s.
exactly,
Everyone
which is
chattering
another
away.
of your things we can learn from history, right? About and you know, to be honest, Roman, that's exactly what we are trying to create here at the Deep Transformation Network. Is that sense of that digital coffee house? Is actually have these conversations going around so we can be setting these kind of fertile thoughts out there. And I'll try to get to some of those if there's questions in the chat. Try to get to some of them too in the second half. But you did leave the book in a beautiful place of this sense of radical hope, which I so share this with you. So this is like hope, not about some sort of probability assessment of the future or whatever it might be, but a state of orientation and the sense that what history can do. Well, why don't you say in your words how the role that history plays in that radical hope we can have about how we engage in the future?
Yeah, after 4 years of casting my gaze across the last 1,000 years of history, as much as I could across different cultures and geographies and time periods, you know, I felt a genuine sense of hope. I mean, I am not a highly optimistic person. I believe that we are on a course for ecological and technological self-termination. I think at business as usual, that is where we are going. Um, but as I look across history, I think to myself, it doesn't have to be this way because so often there are so many examples of us rising to challenges, working together, collaborating to tackle injustices, overcome challenges, the kind of things we've been talking about tonight, but we could have been talking about dozens of other examples. And where these lead me to is something actually I really took from the great American historian Howard Zinn.
Hmm.
Many people will know his book, People's History of the United States. But in 1966, he wrote an essay called Historian as Citizen.
Hmm.
And in that book, he basically said this. He says, look, the past can look, everything can look determined. It can look apocalyptic. It can look like you will never overthrow that regime or change that political system or economic system. But we must always act as if change were possible. Those two little words, as if, are a kind of opening to the third horizon, the new horizon that we must be aspiring to and that we must be creating with every breath and every conversation.
Hmm.
Remember that, the odds may be against you, but if you stick to the vision you are rooted in, and the word hope comes the etymology of the word, a radical comes from the word root. So radical hope is about being
Yes.
committed to something you're rooted in. I think even if the odds are against you, you work at it. Because imagine getting to the end of your life, or and thinking, you know, we could have changed things, but we didn't try. Or imagine future generations judging us for that, for not acting as if. I mean,
Hmm.
what a terrible legacy to have left.
Yeah, which comes back to your earlier book, which I should give a shout out to, The Good Ancestor, which I recommend to everybody to read if you when you get a chance. So let's turn to Guy. Thanks for being so patient, Guy, and thanks for joining us today. And I should just say, in introducing Guy, I think you wrote in the chat, Guy has written a great book, The Economics of Kindness, on similar themes that I have found to be profoundly valuable and inspirational. So thank you for that, Guy. Now,
Well, thanks, Jeremy. It's not published yet. It's been with the New York publishers for a year and still frustrated. But while I'm totally on board with all your stuff, Roman, and with Kate's stuff, when I was writing the chapter on democracy in the book,
Mhm.
just rewriting it, I came across some great material from the OECD about different forms of citizens' assemblies and direct assemblies. And I realized that democracy happens in three acts. So Act One is what I call aristocratic democracy, starting in Magna Carta in Western Europe, when the elite have the vote and no one else. And people like Elon Musk are trying to return us to aristocratic democracy, that only intelligent and technocratic nerds like him should have the vote. The Act Two is representative democracy, which starts with as soon as we get the suffrage and people get the vote, we're getting that. But we're getting the idea. You go on a horse, you go to London or Amsterdam or wherever, and you report back 4 years later. And that comes to its fullest when you get proportional voting. But we need to amplify it with Act Three, which is deliberative, direct democracy, not instead of representative, but in addition. If
Mhm.
you have direct democracy and it's not deliberative, you can have citizens' assembly organized by convoy, protesters here in Canada and vaccine deniers and all the crazies. In fact, those people are organizing town hall meetings around all political stuff for their right-wing extremists. It has to be deliberative as well, which is the real strength of the citizen assembly, when you actually have people chosen by lottery who will think about things rationally and come up to sort of non-partisan conclusions about stuff. So when you combine deliberative and direct, I think on top of representative, you get Act Three of democracy. And I've posted a whole whack of stuff in the chat around that. I just cut and pasted little books from that chapter. And I also wanted to note the Walter Scheidel. I had the same downhearted response when I read his book, but this new Piketty's just got this tiny little book out. It's literally a 1 hour read. He's still selling it for $30, but it's a 1 hour read. He summarizes really clearly, and he says very clearly that political progress, such as you mentioned in Kerala, such as happened in Sweden in particular. He says Sweden was a highly aristocratic, elite-run society until 1920, when the suffrage spread. And then the Social Democrats, once they got power, really did a huge thing to create the relatively egalitarian society. Political change can do stuff that Walter Scheidel is not aware of, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely, Guy. And Roman talked in depth about Finland. In fact, you want to just say a couple of pointers, Roman, about the Finland example. That was the other one, along with Kerala, that was so
Yeah,
powerful.
Finland is a sort of a cousin to the Kerala example of a country which moved from being one of the poorest countries in Europe to one of the most, at the top of 100 different indexes of
Yeah.
well-being and equality and all sorts of things. And it was partly through a similar process of social and collective action. But to pick up on Guy's point, I mean, I really like your sort of historical delineation there, and I think where we are now is I think we need to recognize what the Belgian historian David Van Raybroek calls democratic fatigue syndrome.
Mm.
We've got falling trust in democratic institutions, and you get little blips when you've got maybe a new presidential candidate that people like and things like that. But these are just blips. You've basically got a pattern of falling trust in traditional parties in the system. You've got what political scientists call autocratization. They're more authoritarian governments now than at any time in the last 30 years. And then you've also got this system that's failing to deal with the crisis. Since the alarm bells began to ring at Rio in 1992 on the climate crisis, for example, what's happened to global CO2 emissions? Well, they've more than doubled. And Western governments have not been very successful. Representative democracy hasn't been very successful at dealing with that. So the way I think about it is I sort of think of it as a model of, a bit like you, Guy, actually, kind of what I call communal democracy, with I call it the 3 Ds of deliberative, direct, and also decentralized.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. It's very important to have all of those elements, because a lot of people today talk about, for example, digital democracy. Oh, right. We just need to vote on our apps. And which they have in participatory budgeting in Madrid or in Paris, Porto Alegre. But if you don't have the conversation at the heart of it, you're missing something fundamental. And for many years, I worked with the historian of conversation, Theodore Zeldin, trying to create dialogues in communities. And so I think you're absolutely right on the money there, Guy, or on the post-capitalist.
One quick final thing. I discovered in Switzerland, they've been having deliberative direct democracy since 1891.
Yeah.
Where they vote 4 times a year on stuff. And their trust in government in Switzerland is 84%. The highest in all the OECD nations, because and no one knows the name of the prime minister of Switzerland or the president, because they're so decentralized in what they do. They're quietly getting on with stuff. They're constantly having referenda on things. And look, they've got the trust in government sustained because they're doing that very reform of democracy. But thanks.
And what they also have, there are places in Switzerland that still have the popular assembly model going back to the medieval period in 14th, 15th century, where the whole village, the whole town will come and vote together, like they did in ancient Greece on the Pnyx, the great sort of hillside where 6,000 people would come. So, we've got, so in a way, the history is still alive.
Yeah. Wow. That's great conversation. Let's turn to Nat. You want to bring in your question, Nat?
Hi. Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. I wanted a brief appreciation comment and a question. So the appreciation is just to say, what a wonderful conversation. I just am really aware of your global kind of, the number of examples that you can pull from Japan or Africa, and that's just so inspiring, coupled with your vision. I studied history at university in the early 2000s, and I remember being told explicitly not to use history in the way that you're using it, and that was wrong. And it's just about finding out the facts about the past, and don't mess and muddle with what's happening now. And I thought it was wrong then, and I still think it's wrong. So it's inspiring hearing you say that. The comment, I mean, just when you talked about as if, at the end, act as if, I love that. And just to link it with the fact that the other side, as it were, this capitalist idea has been doing that for centuries in terms of, this idea of the economic human. Everyone knows that's not true, but let's act as if everyone is this.
That is such a brilliant observation.
Yes.
Brilliant.
Price fixated. Everyone has their own inner stockbroker, and if we just do that, then that gives you such a leg up on then sort of changing the world, because you think the world is already the way you want it to be. And then the question actually was about, I'm really intrigued about social media and coffee houses. I see that you have a chapter about that. I haven't read the book, but I was flicking at the table of contents. And obviously, coffee houses were also where some of this stuff originated. Lloyd's of London, the stock exchange. But I'm intrigued about, the positive lessons that could come from that, especially in light of Elon Musk and the UK riots, which probably no one needs
That
reminding of.
is such an important theme. And yeah, perhaps, Roman, you could explain some of the ways, and this comes to your point about how history may not, well, that great quote from Mark Twain, right? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, right?
Yeah.
And so when we look at social media and the disruptive, devastating effects we've seen, we go, well, that's never happened before. But as you explained so well in the book, actually that did happen. And maybe talk about the coffee houses as a way in which something shifted around that.
Yeah. In fact, although I've got my Boro Japanese jacket, I have one other little prop I'm going to show you. I've never shown anybody this before. Hold on just 3 seconds.
What's it going to be?
What is it going to be? It's here. Just watch this. What's going to come out of this is a scroll, which is a reproduction of the first viral blog post from the year 1517. Okay, let me explain.
Yeah.
Some of you might know exactly what I'm talking about here. So I think often when we're thinking about social media, we're amongst the problems we're thinking about are the polarizations that come out of us being in our silos, the algorithms selling us giving us the same news stories. So we've got our pro-Trump and anti-Trump and, climate change activists, climate change deniers, and so on. But if you go back to the history of the printing press, we realize that you can see that this has all happened before. A communications technology creating mass polarizations. And it began when the Protestant reformer Martin Luther, in 1517, he nailed these 95 theses critiquing the Catholic Church to a door in a town called Wittenberg in Germany. And his friends then copied this, translated it from Latin, this is all in Latin, into German, and then it was spread by the new printing presses at the time, right across Germany. And then Luther was a very savvy media operator. He then translated the Bible, the New Testament, into German so it could be read by everyday people, and it filled it full of caricatured woodcuts of the Pope. So even if you're illiterate, you could read it. And basically, the Protestant cause went viral. It was absolutely astonishing. Of the 6 million pamphlets published in the 1520s, 1/3 were the works of Luther. And so the printing press enabled the Protestants to challenge the Catholic hegemony. But what happened was that it inflamed the conflicts between them. And there's very strong historical evidence, and maybe Nat, you study this stuff, was the way the wars of religion, which killed tens of millions of people for the 2 centuries afterwards, were accelerated and inflamed by the printing press. So the printing press has, when I look at the polarizations today, I see them in the printing press, and I see it. I mean, in Britain over the last couple of months, there have been far-right riots based on fake news about so-called, undocumented migrants creating violence, totally fake news. And it's exactly what happened in Germany in the 16th century with the persecution of women, mostly women for so-called witchcraft, where over 25,000 women were executed. Why? Partly because the printing presses spread the fake news stories of young maids traveling with the devil on broomsticks to burn down towns, right? It's the same thing going on. But that's a kind of a warning from history about technology. But the thing about the printing press is that it also helped engendered a democratic culture, the growth of the public sphere in the 17th, 18th century, in combination with another brilliant technology called the coffee house, right? And the explosion of coffee houses in the early 1700s, thousands of them in London at the time. These were places of conversation, and what they had were communal tables, right? And yeah, you're right. Of course, the coffee houses were places where Lloyd's of London insurance brokers began. They were sites of scientific conversation, but above all, there were sites of political conversation, and often very radical conversation. Daniel Defoe, Tom Paine, anti-slavery, Republican ideas. So this was a school of democracy in a sense. And we can think about that today. How do we create the digital coffee houses of today? And I'd say one final point here. I'm in the UK where there are 30,000 coffee shops. Now, imagine if they introduced the communal tables and there were just 10 conversations between strangers a day. There would be over 100 million conversations a year. I think that's part of the great transformation we need. I can't see us having an ecological civilization unless it's also a conversational, it's about a civilization of conversation between strangers.
Yeah, love this, Roman. Thanks. And as you're talking, I keep feeling about what we are here in the Deep Transformation Network community, basically all one of those coffee houses. But then to your point, there's the question, well, are we talking among ourselves? But what about those people who aren't sharing those values and how are we reaching out to them? So I think that's just a great question for us to explore here. But
Can I just say one other thing?
yeah,
Nat's point about capitalism acting as if, I've
right.
never thought about that. And that is very powerful and interesting thought. And let's hope people on this call maybe go and explore that, because that could be a kind of an acupuncture.
Yeah, it
Um,
is.
it's
It is a
very,
very
very
good
interesting.
point, Nat. Thank you for that. I agree. I want to raise a question from the chat actually that kind of relates to this topic we've been talking about from Anton Camarota. He says, in terms of change, how can we move beyond the fear levels that have been instilled and are part of the mass consciousness of industrial societies? So yeah, I'm curious what you think about that, Roman.
Yeah, I mean, fear is a very interesting concept because actually, I think fear has its uses, and I think panic has its uses. But I think fear and panic are most effective when directed at elites in power.
Mm
Um,
hmm
I don't. I think when it comes to motivating people in communities to change or social movement action, that's different. Fear is not a strong motivator, but
hmm
I think one of the lessons of history, and not an iron law. I don't think there are any iron laws in history. I think nothing in history is inevitable until it happens. But there are patterns, and one of the patterns is that the disruptive movements, like the ones I mentioned earlier, they do instill a kind of fear in those in power, thinking if we do not change, we may lose. In the case of the 1831 Jamaica slave uprising, we may lose the island of Jamaica. We may lose our colony, right? So I think that's important. But I do think it's very important to instill hope. And the question is, in a sense, where do we find hope? And all I can say is what I've tried to do in this book, and I'm not saying this is the only place to find hope. I'm trying to almost open up another realm of hope that perhaps had been kind of forgotten.
hmm
Um,
hmm
and of course, anybody who's involved in social movements, community organizations, faith groups will draw on the histories of their own faith or community or movement and be aware of its history, right? So I'm not saying people aren't aware. Um, but there is so much more inspiration in the past than I think we had ever imagined. I sometimes think about it a bit like that idea of shifting baseline syndrome that you've got in ecology. So that idea that scientists or researchers often underestimate the destruction of an ecosystem because their baseline is maybe from the beginning of their childhood or the beginning of their career, and actually the amount of deforestation or the loss of cod or something is much greater. And each new generation shifts up the baseline. And I think that happens with our imaginations in a way that we can't really quite imagine that democracy could be any different. Winston Churchill, said, well, the democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other kinds of which have been tried from time to time. Well, he was wrong, because there have been many other forms of democracy itself that have been very successful, right? And that's where I think let's tap into some of that hope, as well as the hope I find in my children, or the fact that my local street WhatsApp group organized a street market a few weeks ago,
Yeah.
where we were trying to reinvent the economy, almost not direct democracy, but direct economics,
hmm Right.
so let us try and catalog and these types of hope. Let's turn them into works of art.
hmm
In a way, you know, I just up on my bookshelf there, I just out of the corner of my eye, I saw my copy of Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future. You know,
Right. Yeah.
to me, that's a book about hope. What he calls it in his words, his attempt to write the good Anthropocene. And that it's not a utopia, right? It's
No,
messy,
it's
it's
muddled.
complicated.
Yeah.
There are, this transition ain't going to be easy, baby. This is tough stuff. The question, which I think is raised so brilliantly by Nate Hagens, a great energy and systems thinker, is are we going to bend or break? You
Mm-hmm.
know,
Mm-hmm.
as we traverse the turbulence of our time. So I'm all for trying to bend, but that doesn't mean reform. You know,
Right.
bending is our way to something different.
Yes. Yeah. It's this notion of transformative resilience. Like, how can you be resilient to what's happening in a way that you can actually transform what your very like internal structure is as you are? So, yeah, such important thoughts. And let's turn to Ian. If I pronounced your first name correctly, Ian. If not, please correct me. And we've got to get you off mute first. Still on mute? You're still
You
muted.
could unmute me. Oh,
Okay,
there you are.
we have you off
Now
mute now.
I
Great.
forgot the question was.
Oh, yeah, well, you've been waiting a long time.
I know because of the unmute, I thought you were unmuting me. But
Okay.
I was listening with interest because I like the idea of direct democracy.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a very controversial idea about direct democracy because a lot of people just make it a little less direct. Like when we say representative democracy is direct democracy because we elect our representatives. But in fact, it's indirect democracy because we're giving them the power to decide for us, right?
Right.
So direct democracy for me is when every individual, I think was Gramsci who said every citizen should be a legislator. So
Mm-hmm.
when we, the citizens, become legislators, then we don't need the three pillars of government, which is the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. We would need just the two, another two, which are very important for people. And what is the communications? Because if we don't have the right information, if our TV stations and radio stations are dominated by the government, they will tell us the news that the government wants to hear so they can fund the stations, right? Or the
Right.
papers. So communications to me is should be a ministry as important as the executive, as
Mm-hmm.
important as the judicial. If we
Mm-hmm.
are the legislators, we just need the executive government. We should elect politicians to do executive, like ministers, but not to legislate. We legislate. We need judges to make sure that they're governing according to the laws that we have uh,
Mm-hmm.
made. And there's another department of government that we need, and it's very basic, is the uh, the referendum system, the mechanical system where people can go and participate in a computerized system
Mm-hmm.
that is very secure, that's
Mm-hmm.
clear, and that the questions come from us, not from a government, not from the
Mm-hmm.
executive.
Yeah, yeah. I
So
hear you.
we
Yeah,
and instead of having
thanks.
three, and instead of having the three
Yeah.
current legs of government, we would have about four or five, maybe four, because we have the executive, we have the legislative, which is us, the the judicial, the communications to have the right information,
Mm-hmm.
and what was the last one? The
Yeah.
the mechanism, the computerized system. We
Yeah.
have
Mm-hmm.
we have that technology right now,
Yeah.
but we're afraid of using it because everybody would participate in it. And if everybody participates in it, then the governments would find themselves out of business. So we need that change.
Thanks
And
for
about assemblies,
sharing.
I like the idea of assemblies as one of the communications things to learn about the issues. But
Okay.
besides the assemblies, besides the discussion, we have to vote on it. We have to have a referendum. If
Mm-hmm.
we don't have a referendum, we can be discussing the same issue for 100 years and it'll never change because
Okay.
we
Ian, I'm
don't
gonna
have the
have
final.
to have to hold you there. Thanks
But
for sharing those perspectives about that. And
yeah, I'd like to see what Roman
Roman, I
says.
don't know if there's anything you wanted to add from what you said about what Ian was mentioning.
Thanks for those comments, Ian. I mean, they actually remind me of a quote from 1762 from the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau when he was talking about democracy in England. He said, you know, the English people believe themselves to be free, but they are only free during the election of members of parliament. As soon as the members are elected, the people are enslaved.
Right.
And he was right. And I think he would be shocked to discover we still have that same system today. So I think it's absolutely
Yeah.
ready for redesign with many of those elements that you describe, Eon. And so, you know, it's time for a major public conversation about a post-representative government and what that would look like in the same way that, you know, we do a lot of talking about post-capitalist government in circles like these. And it always strikes me, and maybe this is because my background's as a political scientist, actually, it strikes me that there's a lack of equivalent discussion about the political realm. You know, you can have all the sustainable development goals and targets that you like, but if your political systems are still wrapped and trapped in the same short-term dynamics and things, you're not going to get very far.
Yeah.
But I can see there are lots of other hands
Thanks
up,
for
so we better move
Thanks.
on.
Yeah.
Conversation. More
And
than a
as
conversation, I think we need
Peter
a
mentioned
referendum to
in
find
the
out what
chat
people
before,
say.
as he mentioned in the chat, so far we've had what he's called a bit of a blokey session, which is kind of ironic in a way, since so much of what you've written about, Roman, is the empowerment of women. And on the DTN, we tend to be quite very, very focused on these themes. So let me just jump past Till and Stephen temporarily and move to Anneke, who is the first identified woman as having put her hand up. So let's hear from you, Annie, and then come back to Till.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Roman. I've been listening to your book this last week, and it's been very pleasant and informative and inspiring. And I was curious because, Jeremy, you have been writing about cognitive history a lot, and I was curious about how the two of you think cognitive history and social movements are intertwining. And for some reason, I've been thinking about stage theory a lot today, and I felt I have kind of a conflict in me about it. On the one hand, I feel it's very hierarchical, and on the other hand, I feel like it makes sense because one stage emerges after the other, and I've wanted to hear what you think about those themes. Yeah.
Interesting question.
Jeremy, why don't you answer this question first?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, you know, it's kind of I have sort of two perspectives on that, Annie. One is, yeah, I do think cognitive history, which I sort of described as the patterning instinct, like a look really at how different worldviews shape history. I think that is super important. And in fact, there was a question in the chat before about do we need like to evolve to another level of consciousness as a human organism? And in some ways, I believe that is true. But I actually have some very significant issues with this whole notion of stage theory, to exactly the point you raised, Annie, that it's almost this theory coming from another theory, coming from white male, mostly Europeans, saying, oh yeah, the whole of human history is about evolution, cultural evolution, everything to where we are right now. And what we need to do is incorporate all the, all the good things from the past, but we are now at this kind of meta level. And I do have real concerns about that because, of course, the deep wisdom of, in fact, everything you've been talking about, Roman, the deep wisdom of the past, from indigenous peoples all around the world to great cultures of the past, and not necessarily things that we are now above and we need to incorporate, but how can we actually recognize some of the wisdom that's been lost and that we can regain? So I feel we have to be very careful about this kind of sense of stages that we just, by good fortune, find ourselves at the very top, and we now have to jump to that next level to sort of get there. But I wonder what your thoughts are about that, Roman.
I think very similar. I mean, so many of these kinds of theories have a built-in kind of Steven Pinker-esque kind of progress, enlightenment, cognitive bias to them. But the other thing I would say about cognitive history And this is sort of looking at it maybe a little bit different from the way Jeremy's looked at it in the Patterning Instinct, which is such an important book, is to recognize that I think we're in a state of kind of transition in a sense. If you think about, going back to that idea of the printing press I was talking about, there's a lot of very interesting thinking about how the printing press shaped the human mind. And one of the classic kind of arguments, the kind of thing you find in Marshall McLuhan's writing, like his book Understanding Media, for example, is the idea that the way we communicated shifted to a much more internal form of learning about knowledge. So we learn about things not from other people, through the ear, but through the eye, through reading things on a page. And that this also emphasized and accelerated the kind of individualism that commercial capitalism was also driving us towards, that reading itself became a kind of accomplice of Homo economicus, as it became, or as he became in a sense. And I think where we are now is, I don't know what is going to happen to the human mind because of the impacts of digital technologies, for example, Homo interneticus. What will it do to us? Like just the simple thing, the way we search for information, no longer flicking through my old Encyclopedia Britannicas, but through a search box. Now, the meaning of a search box in culture, I think it's going to be very hard. It's still hard to predict what its impacts will be, and of course, many social thinkers in the 1990s were saying, great, we've got this internet thing. It's going to create all these horizontal relationships and we're going to have new anarchist forms of social movements emerge. And many of them did, right? But we've also had all sorts of hierarchical movements emerge too. So a bit like when the printing press was first invented, it was very hard to predict the impacts that it would have on particularly the Western mind. I think the same goes for where we are today. And so I think it's a really important question to ask how cognitive history impacts or intersects with social movements. I think that's very much an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, that's a great thing for us to explore further here on the DTN. And thanks for that question, Annie.
Yeah,
and
thanks.
I'm looking at the time, and we're coming close to our 75 minutes. And what I thought might be a nice idea, if we could just spotlight Till and Stephen and Mary, and ask you each to ask your question, get your voice in the room, but just to really keep it brief, like try to keep it to 30 seconds or no, not much more. So let's hear all three questions and then let Roman answer them in a kind of summary form. So let's begin with you, Till. Thanks for your patience.
Yeah, thanks, guys. So my question is about, we've heard a lot about these societies that are using more deliberative democracies, and how in those societies were young people brought up in order to expect that? As in, how does education sort of enculturate you to expect to be part of a deliberative system, and how can we therefore use that to evolve our current education systems?
Great question.
And I guess that also builds on all the patterning instinct and what we just heard from Annika's point about, how can we, teach the cognitive mind to be more in line with all the writings you've been doing, Jeremy, at young stage?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Till. And let's turn to Mary and ask and get your voice in the room.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. My question is on the citizens' assemblies. Now, modern life is so complex and everything is so specialized with so many little things that influence. So I would imagine that these citizen assemblies should be like specialized groups, because if we randomly pick people that have no knowledge base, then we're not going to really have probably good outcomes. So I would think that they should probably be specialized around certain topics. But you said randomly picked. Well, even juries are not randomly picked. In the United States, they're not. So anyway, tell me your thoughts about that, please. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Really great question, Mary. Thanks. And let's finish with you, Stephen, and then come back to Roman. Oh, Stephen, you're on mute.
Just a a wonderful talk, Jeremy and Roman. I've been teaching alternative development for 25 years, and the progress we've made is incredible. I started a group called the Alternatives Project that looks at education for societal transformation. But I just wanted to give you a footnote to your talk. In graduate school, I worked for the Stanford Research Institute, and they got the papers of Abraham Maslow posthumously. And in those papers, he criticized representative democracy and proposed a system of interlocking T groups, therapy groups, which was his thing, but as a way of governance. Getting psychological health, electing to the next level, and thereafter. So there's a long, interesting tradition. Thank you much for your work. I'm looking forward to reading History for Tomorrow.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. Great. Well, with those really rich questions, let's turn to you, Roman, just to respond to them and to sum up. Yeah, because we're at our time.
Thank you for all of those questions. Well, they are beautifully interrelated, and they remind me very much of something that I did a couple of years ago. I went to speak at a citizens' assembly in Ireland. It was a citizens' assembly on biodiversity loss. And it was very interesting because there were 100 people randomly selected. And yeah, Mary, they were not specialists by any means. And I was skeptical about whether they would be able to discuss something like biodiversity loss, which is actually very technical, not just about how ecosystems work, but European Union biodiversity law they had to get their heads around and things like that. And what astonished me was that, so they were meeting over 4 weekends to discuss this issue. And it was the most diverse group of people I'd ever spoken to in my life. And they have experts come and help inform their conversation. So they had ecologists and lawyers, and they had me, a kind of philosopher, coming to speak too about being a good ancestor. You know, at the beginning of the first day, they didn't know anything really. Most people didn't know anything about biodiversity loss. They worked in shoe shops or in factories, or they were lawyers or whatever they happened to be. But by the end of the first day, of the 100 people there, 1 in 4 of them had stood up and asked a question to one of the experts on the stage. So they felt included, and their questions were smart and interesting. And the other thing was that, you know, you could see that within just a few hours, when I sat in on some of the facilitated discussions, they'd sit in groups of 6 or 7, people were having really quite sophisticated discussions. That helped overcome my own prejudice, thinking that maybe you don't really need to be an expert. As long as you've got some good people informing you, the question is who chooses the experts, right? Right. And that's very, very important and potentially controversial. On Till's point about kids, and the other thing about this Citizens Assembly on Biodiversity Loss in Ireland is they had a parallel session, a Citizens Assembly for Children and Youth on biodiversity loss, and they had their own discussions which fed into the main discussion. It was an experiment in Ireland. It was very successful, and I think it was right to do it. But I would say that the citizens' assemblies need to be open to more young people themselves and not have it as a parallel process. You know, at the time of the last 2 UK general elections ago, when my kids were 11, my partner and I gave our children our votes. So they told us which parties to vote for, and we sat around the kitchen table and discussed them. And this is the kind of, if we're going to have the direct deliberative democracy, if we're going to have the Maslow style interlocking groups, all these things, we need to radically rethink what education looks like. My kids hate citizen education at school. It's completely boring. You know, I don't know the best way to reinvent it, but I think one way we can help reinvent it is to recognize, just to sum up now, how much we can draw on from the past, how many traditions we can look to, how much wisdom there is under the surface there, and let's draw on every culture that we can. Let's create a kind of a gigantic encyclopedia of the possible, but always have, I think, in our hearts the wisdom that we find in so many peoples around the world. There's a beautiful Maori proverb, which is in English, it's, I walk backwards into the future with my eyes fixed on the past. My pronunciation is bad, but it is something like kia whakatomuri ta haere whakamua. You know, to carry that with you, I think is a kind of an existential call to a different world.
I love that. And also I might add is a great way to respond to Anna's question about stage theory is, I mean, that quote really says it all, Roman. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for what you brought to us here on the DTN today. I mean, you know, like, and for people who haven't yet read his book, totally recommend it. And hopefully you'll be inspired after today to take a look yourself. And I love, as I said, how you end it with that thing of radical hope. And it feels to me that this is what you've been transmitting through us today, that we can be inspired by history, we can be inspired by each other, and we can recognize that we can actually transform the world in a way that could lead to that positive future we want. So thanks as always, Roman. Your wisdom and your insights are just so special. And it's been
what
great.
about my jacket?
And the jacket, I'm jealous as all hell. I can tell you that much. Okay, take care. Until next time, see you all. Thanks everyone for a great session today.
Thank you all very much. Brilliant questions, and I can't wait to read all the chat properly. So thank you very much for all your thoughts.
Okay.